Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Ben Grauer speaking from the NBC booth at the War Memorial Opera House in San Francisco on the occasion of the second plenary session of the United Nations Conference on International Organization. The conference session for today was called for approximately this hour and undoubtedly will be underway in just a few moments. Meanwhile, we're standing here in the, if we may use the term ordinarily associated with the Metropolitan Opera House of New York, the grand golden horseshoe of the San Francisco Opera House, and a brilliant and animated scene is presented to our eyes. On the stage is the severely simple, modernistically designed and impressive auditorium platform with the 4 plinths in the rear, in which are enshrined the 46 flags of the 46 nations present at this conference. Immediately in front is the light blue dais with its cluster of microphones, and below it the speaker's platform. A softer tone of blue shades off to the either side of the stage and provides steps from which the delegates can leave their seats when it comes their turn to speak and come up to the platform. The auditorium is approximately half full, in fact 3/4 full, I would say, as the delegates are assembling and awaiting the appearance of the temporary chairman of the conference, Secretary of State Edward Stettinius. This is the second plenary session. The first session yesterday heard addresses by the chiefs of delegations of the 4 inviting powers of this conference, the United States, Great Britain, Russia, and China. And the order of business for today includes an interesting and provocative report by the steering committee, and then further addresses to the delegates by the chairmen of each delegation. We understand that the order will be alphabetically, with perhaps Australia being the first speaker. We're looking over into the left side of the auditorium now, into the section reserved for the 6 members of the American delegation. We see Lieutenant Commander Harold Stassen just a moment ago leaned forward to the row ahead of him and exchanged a few words with the Foreign Minister of Great Britain, Anthony Eden, who is seated, in fact, directly in front of him. I see Senator Arthur Vandenberg sitting quietly, looking about the scene. Some of the other members of the American delegation who are here have left their seats for a moment. There's a rather informal visiting hour going on, and the gentlemen of the lens are seizing every chance to get as many informal portrait studies as they can of the delegates present. Right directly below us, I glimpsed for a moment, yes, there's Commissar Molotov of Russia, and he has just risen in his chair to shake hands with an unidentified delegate. Alongside him, I see Russian Ambassador to the United States, Gromyko, and to the left of Commissar Molotov, the shy, retiring, and very studious young man, Anton Pavlov, his interpreter, who gave the translation of his address yesterday. Over on the right side of the auditorium is the familiar to us, convention attendants, familiar to us now, picture of the Arabian delegation. The 5 members of the Saudi Arabia group are in their usual place on the right-hand side of the Opera House, distinctive in the cream or ivory-colored burnous which they wear, a headgear which drapes over the neck and gently over the shoulders and is caught in position by a distinctive golden and black headdress. I understand the black trimming is horsehair from the native Arabian steeds. And again, a distinctive picture at these plenary sessions is the presence of the Indian delegates, who are somewhere in the center of the auditorium. More personalities are visible. There is Marshal Jan Smuts of the Union of South Africa, that great warrior through several conferences, whose presence here is an important part of the general conference picture. Other members of, yes, there is Dean Virginia Gildersleeve, the only woman member of the American delegation. She is chatting with Commander Stassen. Clement Attlee, the distinguished labor leader of Great Britain, is seated now next to Sir Anthony Eden, and next to Anthony Eden, and is talking with him. And I'm looking for the familiar figure of the Foreign Secretary of Mexico, Padilla. Where is that? It's a large... There he is. I see him right now, seated in approximately the center of the auditorium. Just behind him are some members of the Chinese delegation, including an interestingly garbed Chinese delegate in marine uniform, Navy uniform, with the convoluted gold braid which indicates admiral rank. The general scene suggests that as the seats fill up, we should expect Secretary Stettinius in any moment. It had been expected that the meeting would start now, but as these sessions are somewhat unwieldy in the number of delegates required, it may be a few minutes before the smiling and energetic white-maned figure of Edward Stettinius comes up on the platform again. Over towards the, just in front of the Russian delegation, a few rows, I can see members of the French delegation, including Paul Boncoeur, and there's quite a little visiting going on back and forth here in the brilliantly lighted auditorium of the San Francisco Opera House. Earlier this afternoon, the press was called to a conference at which Secretary Stettinius was to make an important statement, a conference generally called for the press and radio. We waited several hours, an hour and a half, before the Secretary was able to leave the deliberations of the steering committee, which were holding him up for his report. He told us at that time that the question of the permanent chairmanship, the presidency of the conference, would be decided, rather would be reported to the delegates proper at this session. And sometime in the business of this afternoon session, we will have the report of the steering committee, which will indicate their solution of the thus far somewhat vexing problem of the presidency of the conference. I see, looking back again at the French delegation, I see Monsieur Boncoeur of the French delegation smiling. He, of course, is that veteran of League of Nations conferences, one of the most famous figures in international diplomacy. More activity now in the, I thought we had a little stir there in the British delegation, but if anything, I'd say there's a touch of ennui on the handsome face of Anthony Eden. He's registering a slight, discreet as it must be, yawn, and I guess he, like everyone else here who's in his seat, wants this meeting to get on. Interesting sidelights, thoroughly unofficial, but still part of the picture of our meeting here in the Opera House, are the number of luminaries of the number of guests. I saw in the next booth the vivacious figure of Miriam Hopkins of Hollywood fame. Edward G. Robinson was in one of the other booths a moment ago. Brock Pemberton, the distinguished theatrical producer, dropped in and has taken his place in one of the visitors' seats. Nelson Rockefeller, the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs and Assistant Secretary of State, is now chatting with Senor Padilla of Mexico. I see also the venerable figure of Jose Cerrato, the Foreign Minister of Uruguay. Senor Cerrato is a distinguished member of the Latin American Corps in the at the United Nations Conference. The press and the photographers are much in abundance now. This is here is Secretary of State Stettinius, temporary chairman of the United Nations Conference, coming onto the platform very simply with Alger Hiss, the recording secretary, and another unidentified gentleman. And so we'll take you down to the platform and Secretary Stettinius.
Fellow delegates, ladies and gentlemen, the second plenary session of the United Nations Conference on International Organization is hereby convened. The first part of our session this afternoon will be devoted to the business of organizing the conference. After this is completed, the chairman of the delegations, other than the chairman of the sponsoring delegations who spoke at the first plenary session yesterday, will address the conference. The chairman of the delegations met yesterday morning and again this morning for the purpose of considering and recommending to the plenary session the organization of the conference. The meeting of the chairman of delegations appointed the chairman of the delegation of Cuba, Dr. Guillermo Belt, as rapporteur, who will now present to you his report based upon the action of the steering committee. Each item, as it is presented by Dr. Belt, will be considered immediately after it is read. And I now ask Dr. Belt and welcome him to the rostrum. Dr. Belt.
Dr. Guillermo Belt is the young Cuban ambassador to the United States, member of the Cuban delegation, and he is shaking hands with Secretary Stettinius now, and walking to the platform for the report of the steering committee.
The chairman of all delegations represented at the United Nations Conference on International Organization met on April 26 and 27, 1945 at 10:30 a.m. for the purpose of organizing the conference. The Honorable Edward R. Stettinius Jr., temporary president of the conference, acted as chairman. Working languages of the conference. The meeting recommends that a plenary session of the conference addressed in English or French would not be interpreted into the other language, but that the translation would appear subsequently in the record. Delegates would be free to use any other language besides English or French, but in this case, they should provide interpretation thereof into either English or French at their choice. Interpretations may be made into both English and French if the speaker desires. As regards meetings of commissions, technical committees, and subcommittees, it is recommended that interpretation from English into French and vice versa could be provided if the meeting in question so desire. Delegates could be free in these bodies also to speak in any other language, but should provide their own interpretation into either English or French.
That's your first recommendation. Does any delegate wish to comment upon this recommendation? In the absence of objection, the recommendation will be approved. Dr. Belt, will you continue with your report?
Official languages of the conference. The meeting recommends that English, Russian, Chinese, French, and Spanish be the official languages of the conference. A more detailed report on languages will be made tomorrow.
Is there any comment on this recommendation by any delegate? If not, the recommendation is approved.
The meeting unanimously elect the chairman of the delegation of Cuba as its rapporteur. Secretary General of the conference. The meeting recommends the confirmation of the temporary Secretary General, Mr. Alger Hiss, as the Secretary General of the conference.
Hearing no objection, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Hiss is approved by acclamation.
Organization of the conference. The meeting approved the memorandum prepared by the temporary Secretary General on the proposed organization of the conference and will submit to the conference its report based thereon as soon as possible. Election of presiding officers. The meeting recommends that there be 4 presidents who will preside in rotation at the plenary sessions. These 4 may meet from time to time, with Mr. Stettinius presiding over this meeting, and Mr. Stettinius to be chairman of the executive and steering committees, the others delegating full powers to Mr. Stettinius for conducting the business of the conference. Membership of...
Has any delegate any comment on this suggestion? Is there an objection? The recommendation is approved. Dr. Belt, will you proceed?
Membership of the Executive Committee: the Honorable Francis Michael Ford or the Honorable Herbert Ver Evert, Chairman of the Delegation of Australia; the Honorable Pedro Lau Veloso, Chairman of the Delegation of Brazil; the Honorable W.L. Mackenzie King, Chairman of the Delegation of Canada; the Honorable Joaquín Fernández y Fernández, Chairman of the Delegation of Chile; the Honorable T.V. Sun, Chairman of the Delegation of China; the Honorable Jan Masaryk, Chairman of the Delegation of Czechoslovakia; the Honorable Georges Bidault, Chairman of the Delegation of France; the Honorable Mostafa Adl, Chairman of the Delegation of Iran; the Honorable Ezequiel Padilla, Chairman of the Delegation of Mexico; the Honorable Elko van Kleffens, Chairman of the Delegation of the Netherlands; the Honorable V.M. Molotov, Chairman of the Delegation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics; the Honorable Anthony Eden, Chairman of the Delegation of the United Kingdom; the Honorable Edward R. Stettinius Jr., Chairman of the Delegation of the United States; the Honorable Ivan Subik, Chairman of the Delegation of Yugoslavia.
You have heard the recommendation for the membership of the Executive Committee. Are there any further nominations? If there are no further nominations for members of the Executive Committee, the Executive Committee will stand approved as recommended by the Steering Committee. Dr. Belt.
Agenda of the conference. The meeting recommends that the conference approve as its agenda the Dumbarton Oaks proposal as supplemented at the Crimea Conference and by the Chinese proposals agreed to by all the sponsoring governments and the comments thereon submitted by the participating countries.
Has any delegate any comment on this recommendation? If there's no comment, the recommendation stands approved.
Rules of procedure. The meeting discussed the rules of procedure for the conference on the basis of a memorandum prepared by the Secretariat. The report of the meeting will be submitted to the conference in plenary session for its approval as soon as possible. Initial membership of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic in the proposed international organization. The meeting recommends that the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic be invited to be initial members in the proposed international organization.
Does any delegate wish to comment on this unanimous recommendation of the Steering Committee to the plenary session? Hearing no objection, the recommendation is approved.
Credentials committees. The meeting appointed as Credentials Committee composed of 7 members, appointed by the chairman of the delegations of the following governments: Luxembourg, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Yugoslavia. Participation of Poland in the conference. The meeting recommends to the conference in plenary session the adoption of the following resolution. The government of the United Nations express to the people of Poland their sympathy and their admiration. They hope that the constitution of a Polish government, recognized as such by the sponsoring nations, will make it possible for Polish delegates to come and take part as soon as possible in the work of the conference.
Thank you, Dr. Belt, for your very fine and very brief and very efficient report. Dr. Bell, who proposes the resolution? Gentlemen, the last resolution that Dr. Belt read that was introduced this morning by the Foreign Minister of Belgium has been recommended to the plenary session. Do I hear any objection for the adoption of this resolution? Hearing no objection, the resolution is approved. Thank you, Dr. Belt. Ladies and gentlemen, this completes the business to be taken up today. We now come to the second part of our program. Now I recognize the delegate from Australia who will speak in behalf of the Australian delegation, the Right Honourable Francis M. Ford, Deputy Prime Minister of Australia.
Deputy Prime Minister Francis Michael Ford.
Mr. President, fellow delegates, ladies and gentlemen, Australia joins her voice with those of other nations in paying tribute to the memory of the late President Roosevelt. He fought the battle for world security for many testing years, and I venture to suggest that he won it before he passed away. We in Australia know in full the calamity of war, what it costs in sacrifice, human suffering, and wasted opportunities of peaceful development. With our population cannot hope to stand alone against the aggression of larger and stronger powers. That realization is the basis of our national policy. The Australian delegation is determined to do its utmost to make this conference a success. We share the desire for dispatch expressed yesterday by the Right Honourable Anthony Eden. We too are anxious to get down to business. We believe that yesterday's speeches indicated a real willingness to see the Charter improved without impairing its fundamental principles. In our view, the success of the conference will be measured by one test. Will it bring into existence an organisation which will give to the peoples of the world a reasonable assurance of security from war and a reasonable prospect of international action to secure social justice and economic advancement? The acceptance by the nations of the invitation to this conference means that we are already agreed that world organisation is necessary and that the Dumbarton Oaks draft is a suitable basis of discussion. There is an even wider area of common agreement on relative principles. For example, by the United Nations Declaration of January 1942, incorporating the text of the Atlantic Charter, and by subsequent adherence to that declaration, all the United Nations have accepted three great postulates. One, the establishment of a peace which will offer to all nations the means of dwelling in safety within their boundaries, and which will afford an assurance that all the men in all the lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear and freedom from want. Two, the fullest collaboration in the economic field with the objects of securing for all improved labour standards, economic advancement, and social security. 3, the eventual abandonment of the use of force, but in the meantime, the immediate use of force to curb aggression. Of course, no absolute guarantees can be given, but in the past, the leaders of the United Nations have made solemn promises to our peoples and especially to our fighting men. History will pass a severe judgment upon us all if we fail in the endeavor to translate these promises into action. The new association of nations must be endowed with sufficient military power to deal effectively and ruthlessly with any resurgence of fascism and with any immediate threat to world peace. At the same time, the Constitution of the Association must be made capable of development to meet new situations as they arise. We are substantially agreed on basic objectives. We have to apply ourselves realistically and intensively to translating our fervent desires into firm commitments and into principles and methods of action. Instruments like the Atlantic Charter did not sketch a character for Europe alone. Over 3 years ago, the Australian government stressed the point that the principles of the Atlantic Charter were to be made effective as much in the Pacific and Asiatic countries as in those bordering the Atlantic. It is particularly fitting that this conference is being held on the shores of the Pacific Ocean. The location will remind us, if reminder is needed, that even when European fascism has been destroyed, another barbarous aggressor, Japan, must be compelled to surrender. The cardinal points of Australia's policy in relation to security may be restated as follows. A, there must be speedy and orderly procedures for the peaceful handling of disputes between nations. B, there must be a system of sanctions which can be imposed very rapidly and which will be based on the united military strength of the great powers, but shared in by all powers. C, a permanent system of security can be made effective and acceptable only if it has a foundation in economic and social justice, and real international stability can be achieved only by promoting measures of economic advancement as well as by maintaining security. This, I may add, is the policy for which my colleague here, Dr. Evatt, has striven for years. I gladly acknowledge the ability and energy with which, as Minister for External Affairs, he has handled international problems of the war and post-war years. Australia has welcomed the general acceptance of the Dumbarton Oaks principles. We do not speak as theorists, but because as a nation fighting in 2 wars, not for ourselves alone, but for world security, we have learned by bitter experience that peace and security are indivisible, and that nations in the Pacific cannot contract out of Europe any more than European nations can contract out of the Pacific. Basic requirement fully and fairly recognized by the Dumbarton Oaks proposals. For the organization to succeed, all members of the United Nations must pledge themselves to cooperate in carrying out, by force, wherever needed, the decisions of the organization for the preservation of peace. We believe that the obligation to contribute to enforcement action should be accepted by all members, and that decisions of the organization to apply enforcement measures should be equally binding on all members. The expectation that there will be complete and immediate application of measures for collective security is essential both to deter the would-be aggressor and to bring reassurance to the peoples of the world who look for security. In our view, the acceptance of this obligation is fundamental. It is now the duty and the opportunity of this conference to pass from general principles to the practical working rules of the proposed organization. In this task, we should attempt precision of thought and language, and avoid the oratorical flourishes which only serve to conceal the real difficulties in hammering out a workable constitution. The best initial contribution any nation can make to this conference is to say frankly where it stands, to indicate how much of the Dumbarton Oaks proposals it is prepared to accept without reserve, and to set out the points on which it finds difficulty and seeks improvement. By this process, we can ascertain the area of apparent difference. Then we should be able to reduce that area until it ceases to be of any significance. While accepting the general principles of the Dumbarton Oaks proposals, we are of opinion that, in some respects, they call for expansion and amendment. We propose, therefore, to make positive and constructive suggestions to the conference on certain points. First, we accept the principle that there should be a Security Council of the World Organization vested with wide executive power and authorized to act immediately on behalf of members of the organization in meeting a threat of armed conflict. We also accept the principle that for the purposes of security, the greater powers should act as a unit, and therefore that these powers can be properly accorded special recognition. They will have the major responsibility for the joint exercise of military power. They are therefore entitled to all the rights and prerogatives which are incidental to or reasonably necessary for the application of sanctions against an aggressor. One of these rights is the so-called veto power. The term veto is not altogether a happy one. In relation to sanctions, it means only this, that if the World Organization is to exercise economic or military sanctions against an aggressor, which of course involves acts of war, its leading members must act unitedly or not at all. But the very considerations which are appropriate to enforcement action by the greater powers are out of place in relation to the settlement of disputes by means of conciliation, arbitration, or by other pacific means. In such cases, which are covered by Chapter 8A of the proposals, the Security Council should be empowered to act by the proposed majority of 7, without the requirement of the approval by each and every one of the 5 great powers. I think that this point of view is implicit in the Alta formula, which in relation to Chapter 8A prevents a power which is party to a dispute from voting at all. Why any of 5 powers which is not party to a dispute should be empowered to prevent attempts to settle it by means of conciliation and arbitration, we are quite unable to discover. We think a mistake has been made and that all the powers concerned should be ready to correct it at this conference. Second, we consider that in the processes for the pacific settlement of disputes, the maximum use should be made of the permanent court, both for fact-finding and for terminating disputes which are capable of settlement by reference to standards of international law. The permanent court has been a successful institution, and we hope a step forward will be taken in relation to its compulsory jurisdiction. Third, we think express provision should be made in the Charter, the better to secure the political independence and territorial integrity of individual nations. These rights are the very basis of a nation's existence. Unless they are fully respected, the principle of the sovereign equality of nations, declared in the Moscow Declaration and the Dumbarton Oaks draft, would become an empty phrase. At the same time, we recognize that in the course of time, adjustments in the existing order may become necessary, not so much for the preservation of peace as for the attainment of international justice. The Charter could therefore properly declare that the organization should exert its powers for the promotion of justice and the rule of law. In the Charter should also be inserted a specific undertaking by all members to refrain in their international relations from force or the threat of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state. The application of this principle should ensure that no question relating to a change of frontiers or an abrogation of a state's independence could be decided other than by peaceful negotiation. It should be made clear that if any state were to follow up a claim to extend its frontiers by using force or the threat of force, the claimant would be breaking a specific and solemn obligation under the Charter. In such a case, it would surely be impossible for the Council to decide the dispute in favor of the nation that had violated its obligations. The powers and functions of the General Assembly in regard to the settlement of disputes should be clarified. The General Assembly is to comprise all members. Ultimately, it should become the central organ or the forum in which the conscience of the peoples of the world should have its most potent expression. We admit one exception, and one exception only, to the right of the Assembly to consider and to make recommendations as it thinks fit with regard to any matter affecting international relations. While the Security Council is handling a dispute in accordance with Chapter 8 of the Dumbarton Oaks proposals, nothing should be done to diminish the authority of the Council or to hamper the prompt settlement of the dispute. We suggest that, on taking over a dispute, the Security Council should give some clear indication as to whether it is actively handling the matter. During the period when the matter is being so handled, the Assembly can fairly be precluded from dealing with the subject on its own initiative. But it is equally essential that the Assembly should be kept notified of the position so that it would be competent to make positive recommendations in relation to the matter in case the dispute should become frozen in the Security Council. It was in this way that the Chinese-Japanese dispute became frozen during the period when Japan first taught other fascist aggressors how to snap their fingers at solemn international obligations. We must speak plainly about the composition of the Security Council. Its powers in relation to the employment of force by the World Organization will be tremendous. As I have said, the great powers are entitled to a special position in relation to the application of sanctions. United action is essential to stamp out an aggressor, but the application of the same principle in the cause of the selection of non-permanent members of the Council requires that special attention be paid to the proved willingness and capacity of members to make a substantial contribution to security. It will have to be recognized that outside the great powers, there are certain powers who, by reason of their resources and their geographical location, will have to be relied upon especially for the maintenance of peace and security in various quarters of the world. Like France, Canada, and other countries, Australia has consistently maintained this principle. But there is another principle of even greater importance. Certain powers, not classified as great, have proved by their record in 2 world wars that they not only have the capacity but also the will to fight in resistance of aggressors threatening the world with tyranny. These powers are, in a sense, proved veterans in the struggle against fascist dictatorship threatening the security of the world. They are, in truth, security powers. They have a claim to special recognition in any security organization. There are various ways in which this special claim might be recognized. One suggestion is that categories of non-permanent members should be drawn up so as to ensure that the non-permanent members of the Security Council do in fact represent powers whose material resources, geographical location, and willingness to resist aggression make their actual cooperation with the great powers absolutely essential to the effective working of a security system. I have specially emphasized the subject of security because it's a matter on which we feel most strongly. For more than 5 years, our soldiers, sailors, and airmen have been fighting against aggressors in almost every theatre of the world war. During part of that time, we had no one to depend on except our own kith and kin in other British countries and the strength of our own arms. Part of our external territory was invaded and our whole national life disrupted. There are other countries in the same case, countries which in 2 world wars have fought to the full extent of their resources and borne the brunt of the fighting for the security of all peoples, while, for one reason or another, many other countries did little or nothing to resist the aggressors. Now we are being asked to commit ourselves to fight again in case of future aggression anywhere in the world. We must be reasonably certain that on these future occasions other nations will stand with us. Our case is not different from that of others, but it is vital to us to have a security system that will really give us security. I have already emphasized the principle that under the proposed security system, the obligation to contribute will be binding on all members. Acceptance of that principle implies that we must be ready to give, but in return there must be an assurance of security, an assurance that if we are attacked, the nations of the world will come to our assistance, just as we have in fact gone promptly to their assistance in the past. Australia has given clear proof of her willingness to make sacrifices for security. She was in the war in 1914, immediately after the invasion of Belgium by Germany. She was in the war in 1939, immediately after the invasion of Poland by Germany. Therefore, the people of Australia, and I suggest the people of every other country similarly situated, have a right to look for a reasonable assurance of security. One form the assurance can take is a knowledge that the members of the Security Council, who will have to make decisions regarding enforcement action, will be real and not nominal security powers. Let me turn now to the proposal for economic and social cooperation. Australia's foreign policy has long been specially concerned with the arrangements for economic and social cooperation. We take the view that peace and security must rest on economic justice and social security. Apart from the relationship of welfare to security, welfare is an end in itself. Greater welfare, employment for all, and rising standards of living for the masses have been promised in international declarations such as the Atlantic Charter and in the national declarations of policy of most of the socially advanced countries of the world. All this has been pledged. It is necessary to redeem the pledge. The pledge should be written into the Charter of the World Organization as an objective. But that is not enough. Suitable machinery must be provided for the progressive fulfillment of the pledge. The statement of principles is clear enough. the United Nations declared themselves in the Atlantic Charter in favor of the fullest collaboration between all nations in the economic field with the object of securing for all improved labor standards, economic advancement, and social security. There is everything to be said for a repetition of the words of this plain declaration in the Charter of the World Organization. The declaration is clear in its meaning. We will therefore suggest the inclusion in the Charter of an undertaking by which all members of the organization will pledge themselves to take appropriate action, both national and international, for the purpose of securing for all peoples, including their own, improved labor standards, economic advancement, and social security, and, as part of that pledge, to take appropriate action through the instrumentality of the General Assembly, the Economic and Social Council, the ILO, and such other bodies as may be brought into relationship with the international organization. We believe that member countries should not only enter into this pledge, but should also accept the obligation to render reports on the action they are taking to carry it out. We also propose that the Economic and Social Council be made one of the principal organs of the World Organization, and will make proposals vesting in the Council certain powers and functions in addition to and in expansion of those set out in the Dumbarton Oaks proposals. We also believe that, in order to carry out its functions and responsibilities, the Economic and Social Council, like the Security Council, should be in permanent session with continuous representation of those nations elected to it. It comes to this: real stability in the post-war world can be achieved only by carefully building an organization that will do its utmost to assure the peoples of the world a full opportunity of living in freedom from want, as well as in freedom from fear of external aggression. The Australian government urges that the Charter of a World Organization should recognize that the main purpose of the administration of dependent or underdeveloped territories is the welfare and advancement of the peoples of those territories. This was recognized in Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations in respect of territories which were at the disposal of the Allied powers as a result of the War of 1914-18. While no doubt certain modifications arising out of experience should be made in the terms of existing mandates, on the whole, we believe the system worked reasonably well. Certainly, most of its principles could safely be extended to dependent territories, taken away from our enemies in the present war, subject to the overriding requirements of controlling bases and facilities for the purpose of security. These detached territories should properly be held in trust for the native inhabitants. They should be administered under terms which will impose upon the administering power a duty to the United Nations to promote the welfare of these dependent peoples. We believe also that this principle of trusteeship, which in modern times powers have frequently recognized in relation to their colonial possessions by positive unilateral declarations, cannot in principle be confirmed to undeveloped territories formerly belonging to our enemies in World War I or World War II. Otherwise, native peoples would be in a better position merely because they had once been under enemy sovereignty. We therefore wish to see provision in the Charter for the continuance of the mandate system, the establishment of new mandates, the recognition of the principle that the purpose of the administration of dependent territories is the welfare and advancement of the peoples of such territories. We also wish to see the setting up of an expert organ of the United Nations, the function of which will be to inform the World Organization of the welfare and progress of the peoples of mandated territories and such other dependent territories as may be determined upon by appropriate action. It is quite wrong to call such a system international direction or international supervision. There would be no interference with sovereignty. All that would be done would be to treat the welfare of dependent peoples as a matter not only of local but of international concern. We were reminded yesterday of the futility of straining after a perfect charter. This is true, but we must not let that idea block the possibilities of improving the charter here and now. Nor must we allow the possibilities of improvement later to be obstructed by adopting too rigid a constitutional form. Mr. Statinius reminded us that 10 vital amendments in the United States Constitution were made within 4 years of its adoption. The parallel must not be pushed too far. No amendment of the Charter as it now stands will be possible without the unanimous consent of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Any one of the 5 will therefore be able to make the present Constitution immutable. If the United States Constitution had given to the 5 major original states a similar entrenched position, I do not think that many constitutional amendments would have been carried. The Dumbarton Oaks plan, as it stands, bears very many characteristics of a mere prolongation into the years of peace, of the type of great power leadership that has been found necessary in order to win the war. It would be wise, therefore, to regard the plan as having many transitional features. If that is conceded, the organization could start off in the expectation that the Charter would be progressively modified to fit the normal conditions of international relations after the period of post-war rehabilitation has been completed. To that end, however, the amending process needs greater flexibility. Australia will propose an amendment for this purpose. In placing Australia's views before you, my colleague Dr. Everett and I have endeavored to state our position frankly and realistically. There is no time to waste on mere generalities. There is, as we have been reminded, a job to be done. We desire to serve our people and the peoples of the world. We will be no party to building up hopes of a better world unless the machinery for building that world is likely to work. We put these views before the great powers in the hope and belief that, except in principle and general application, the Dumbarton Oaks proposals will not be treated as sacrosanct or beyond criticism. Our confidence in, like our gratitude towards those powers, is very great. They have led us out of the jaws of death. Our relationship to the United Kingdom is one of the closest kinship, and to the war effort of Great Britain, the whole world owes a great debt. We admire the epic deeds of the Red Army and the great sacrifices of the people of the Soviet Union. China's long-sustained resistance against Japan gave us enough time to hold back that powerful and unscrupulous foe. And towards the people of the United States of America, whose soldiers have done so much for Australia, we will always be deeply grateful. For over 3 years, our cooperation with the United States in the Pacific has been of great and decisive significance. The Coral Sea Battle, the Midway Battle, the Solomons Battle, all these battles decided the fate of Australia. And had America not been able to send tens of thousands of the flower of her manhood and hundreds of fighters and bombers to the southwestern Pacific at that period, Australia would have been overrun by the Japanese. To France, we pay special homage because of our association in New Caledonia and the sacred memories of the First Great War. France's rapid restoration as a great power rejoices the hearts of all lovers of what is best in Western civilization. And I speak with some feeling on this subject because in recent weeks my colleague Dr. Everett and I had an opportunity of visiting Paris, of meeting the French people, and of learning of the great revival that had taken place and of the way they were standing wholeheartedly behind their government. We appeal to all countries, and especially to the great powers, not to shrink from making improvements in the Charter merely because a little more time and a little more trouble will be required. What we can do and what we must do is to accept the general principles of the Dumbarton-Oaks plan and proceed as soon as possible to consider all proposals for its improvement. By doing so, we will be doing our duty to those whose sacrifices have made this conference possible. That is the duty of each of us. No man can do more, but no man should do less.
The plenary session of the United Nations Conference has just heard the vigorous and forthright address of the Australian representative Francis Michael Ford. Here is Secretary Stettinius.
Ladies and gentlemen, I now recognize His Excellency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Belgium and the Chairman of the Belgium delegation, Mr. Spock.
Monsieur Spock shakes hands with Secretary Stettinius and addresses the conference.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames, Messieurs, je représente ici un pays 2 fois envahi, 2 fois occupé, 2 fois martyrisé par les Allemands en un quart de siècle. Un pays essentiellement pacifique, heureux, satisfait de son sort, où d'une façon générale, la vie est douce et facile, qui dans un coin du monde, où la civilisation est vieille et raffinée, tient honorablement sa place. Un pays qui aime passionnément la paix, qui a résisté 2 fois héroïquement au cataclysme qui s'est abattu sur lui, mais qui mesure exactement tous les dangers d'une 3e épreuve éventuelle et qui veut tout faire pour la prévenir et pour l'empêcher. C'est vous dire que, porteur de l'espoir des Belges, je suis venu ici avec les membres de ma délégation, décidé à travailler de tout mon cœur à promouvoir dans les relations internationales la sécurité et la justice. Il est peut-être banal de dire encore une fois que nous vivons une heure sans doute décisive dans l'histoire du monde, mais en le répétant sans cesse, nous nous imprégnerons de nos responsabilités. Oui, des millions d'hommes et de femmes ont les yeux fixés sur nous, attendent de nos travaux la réalisation de leurs espoirs, la certitude que leurs souffrances et leurs épreuves n'auront pas été supportées en vain. Hier, dans son discours magnifique et réconfortant, M. Eden disait que notre tâche était difficile, mais que les possibilités étaient grandes. Rien n'est plus juste. Les peuples ont senti, ont compris les dangers que notre civilisation vient de courir. Ils savent que c'est de peu que nous avons échappé au malheur de voir disparaître pour longtemps, peut-être pour toujours, de la surface de la terre, ce qui fait le prix de la vie et la dignité de l'homme. Avec ce sur-instinct qui les guide si souvent, ils sont aujourd'hui disposés à faire l'effort qu'il faut pour empêcher le retour du danger. Ne laissons pas passer l'occasion qui s'offre à nous, elle ne reviendra peut-être jamais. Une organisation internationale complète et parfaite, comportant subordination effective des intérêts particuliers à l'intérêt collectif, est assurément dans les vœux de l'humanité. Si l'on était venu nous offrir de nous y associer, je suis sûr que j'aurais pu apporter le consentement à la fois réfléchi et enthousiaste de mes compatriotes. Il serait inexact de prétendre que les propositions de Dumbarton Oaks et de Yalta nous ont apporté tout ce que nous souhaitions, qu'elles ont comblé tous nos espoirs, qu'elles réclament de nous l'effort maximum que nous étions prêts à accomplir. Mais mes compatriotes et moi-même ne sommes pas de ceux qui se découragent si l'idéal n'est pas atteint du premier coup. Nous savons que la route qui y mène est longue et quelquefois tortueuse, que le progrès est fait d'étapes successives et d'efforts répétés, et ce qui est sorti du travail combiné de 4 grandes puissances amies de la paix, nous l'avons accepté loyalement comme une base de discussion fructueuse. On aurait tort d'ailleurs de se laisser aller à une critique systématique des propositions qui nous sont faites et de ne pas voir, de ne pas souligner ce qu'en certains domaines elles apportent de neuf et de progressif. Comment d'abord ne pas saluer avec joie le fait que la nouvelle organisation internationale nous est cette fois proposée par un groupe de nations où figurent les États-Unis d'Amérique et l'URSS. L'absence de ces deux grands pays lors de la naissance de la Société des Nations a eu des conséquences qui ont pesé sur toute la politique internationale pendant l'entre-deux-guerres. La famille des pays amis de la paix étant incomplète a été nécessairement affaiblie. La présence des États-Unis et de l'URSS aujourd'hui constitue un magnifique renfort et ce seul grand fait est une raison d'espérance et de confiance. Autre raison d'espérer, la tendance, encore incomplète, certes, mais prometteuse, de voir abandonner dans certains domaines la règle traditionnelle de l'unanimité nécessaire pour que des décisions efficaces soient prises. Certes, nous eussions souhaité ici plus d'audace, mais l'indication donnée est heureuse et laisse espérer que dans la voie ouverte aujourd'hui, les nations s'engageront demain avec plus de résolution. Même raison d'espérer quand on voit accepter l'idée qu'il faut organiser une armée internationale capable de faire respecter les décisions de l'organisation. Ce réalisme-là est de ceux qui servent et qui servent puissamment l'idéalisme le plus élevé. Et enfin, raison d'espérer encore, raison d'espérer surtout l'indication que la collaboration économique et sociale ne sera pas négligée. Permettez-moi d'insister un instant sur ce point. Tout le monde aujourd'hui souligne la solidarité nécessaire qui doit se manifester en temps de guerre, et on a raison de le faire. Mais cette solidarité deviendrait probablement inutile si les peuples comprenaient mieux qu'ils doivent s'entraider en temps de paix. Du point de vue stratégique, il n'y a plus de frontières. La guerre éclatant dans un coin du monde ne tarde pas à dévaster le monde tout entier. C'est le terrible spectacle qui nous est donné pour nous rappeler de temps en temps, puisque nous avons tendance à l'oublier, que nous dépendons les uns des autres. Mais pourquoi attendons-nous la guerre pour prendre conscience de cette réalité? Elle existe aussi, elle existe autant, elle existe peut-être plus encore en temps de paix. C'est beau de s'unir pour remporter la victoire. Ce serait encore tellement plus beau et tellement plus efficace et moins coûteux de s'unir pour construire un monde meilleur. On ne peut pas se borner à établir des textes qui ne sont d'application que quand la situation devient grave. Je voudrais que nous construisions quelque chose qui fasse partie de notre vie quotidienne, de nos préoccupations de tous les jours, quelque chose qui se rappelle à nous, pas seulement quand le spectre de la guerre se présente menaçant, mais quelque chose qui nous aide à répondre efficacement aux questions angoissantes que pose l'organisation économique et sociale du monde de demain. Je voudrais que l'organisation internationale qui naîtra de nos travaux nous dise non seulement comment nous ferons pour éviter la guerre, non seulement comment nous ferons pour la gagner si elle éclate malgré tout, mais qu'elle nous apporte aussi les moyens d'assurer la paix en faisant vivre les hommes dans le travail et dans la joie. C'est le moment de nous souvenir que le président Roosevelt, le grand homme dont la volonté nous a réunis ici et dont nous ressentons si douloureusement la perte, n'a jamais dans son esprit séparé sa lutte pour la paix de sa lutte pour la collaboration économique et la sécurité sociale, et que les manifestations de sa pensée puissante et prophétique se marquent autant dans les décisions de Hot Springs, de Bretton Woods et d'Atlantic City que dans la Déclaration des Nations Unies de Washington. Il y a donc des raisons d'espérer. Mais notre confiance, notre optimisme, notre bonne volonté ne doivent pas nous empêcher de voir et de dire certaines difficultés. Les propositions de Dumbarton Oaks et de Yalta posent le problème des relations entre les grandes, les moyennes et les petites puissances. Il est impossible aujourd'hui d'aborder cette question sans dire tout de suite avec quel réconfort nous avons entendu le président Truman déclarer 2 fois, à quelques jours d'intervalle, dans les mêmes termes et avec la même force, que les grandes puissances doivent servir et non dominer le monde. Ces déclarations généreuses sont aussi des déclarations raisonnables. Entre les grandes puissances et les autres pays, ce climat de confiance est indispensable à la collaboration internationale. Cette confiance, elle l'apporte surtout à ces pays qui, comme le mien, pour qui la guerre veut dire aussi l'occupation par l'ennemi. Heureux ceux qui ne connaissent pas cette épreuve, la plus redoutable et la plus pénible de toutes. Aux pays dont l'ambition est d'être à leur place et selon leurs moyens, les bons ouvriers d'une bonne politique internationale. Que les grandes puissances ne se méfient pas de nous. Au contraire, elles doivent souhaiter et stimuler notre coopération. Nous savons ce que nous devons à nos grands alliés. Nous savons les sacrifices qu'ils ont consentis pour remporter la victoire, restaurer la paix, nous rendre notre indépendance, nous délivrer de l'oppression allemande. Nous souhaitons, nous voulons qu'ils restent unis. Nous voyons dans cette union le meilleur gage de la paix du monde et par conséquent de notre sécurité. Nous savons que dans l'organisation à créer, leur grande responsabilité, leur grand devoir leur assigne un rôle spécial que nous sommes prêts à consacrer. Dans tout ceci, il n'y a que la juste mesure à trouver. À première vue, mais à première vue seulement, il semble plus facile de résoudre les problèmes par un accord limité à quelques puissances. Mais l'expérience a démontré que la collaboration de tous les États est une garantie de justice, et seule la justice est le fondement d'une paix durable. Nos buts sont les mêmes, notre idéal est le même, notre sens des réalités est le même. Ce que nous demandons, c'est de pouvoir librement faire entendre notre voix, prendre notre part des charges qu'impose la sécurité du monde et partager les responsabilités générales proportionnellement à nos forces. Que les grandes puissances soient des leaders librement acceptés. Nous avons confiance dans leur force et dans leur expérience. Que de leur côté, elles n'oublient pas que moins portées à nous confier à la force qui nous manque, nous voyons dans le respect de la justice et du droit la suprême sauvegarde de notre existence. C'est cette préoccupation qui nous amène à souhaiter, avec d'autres délégations, que les principes juridiques et moraux sur lesquels la nouvelle organisation doit être basée soient précisés davantage. La volonté de maintenir la paix est un but, certes hautement louable, mais l'histoire récente nous a montré qu'il était nécessaire, pour l'atteindre, de rester fidèle à certaines règles de droit. Nous ne pouvons pas dissocier dans nos esprits l'idée de justice et l'idée de paix. Il ne faut pas que nous soyons acculés à ce douloureux dilemme de devoir choisir entre la justice et la paix. C'est dans cet esprit de loyale et constructive coopération que nous voulons aider à résoudre les problèmes que posent les propositions de Dumbarton Oaks et répondre ainsi à l'appel qui nous a été adressé par les représentants des puissances invitantes. Hier, M. Eden nous conviait à travailler vite, à ne pas nous perdre dans les détails et à ne pas oublier qu'un travail comme celui que nous avons entrepris aujourd'hui peut toujours être complété, revisé, amélioré. Il a raison. Ce sont des directives claires que l'on attend de nous. Le pacte que nous devons élaborer doit être rédigé sans doute par des spécialistes, mais il est fait pour les peuples. Qu'il soit simple, et n'oublions jamais que les textes les meilleurs ne valent rien si l'esprit ne les anime pas. Ce qui importe avant tout, c'est notre volonté d'agir, de réussir, notre désir passionné de ne pas décevoir tous ceux qui espèrent. Au moment où la victoire va couronner nos efforts, il nous faut donner confiance à ceux qui ont souffert et les persuader que les sacrifices consentis et les épreuves subies n'auront pas été inutiles.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'll now recognize the chairman of the Bolivian delegation, Senor Andrade, the Bolivian ambassador to Washington. Mr. Ambassador.
Following the address by Monsieur Paul Spock, the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Belgium, which was delivered in French, we now have the address by Victor Andrade, Ambassador to the United States, member of the Bolivian delegation to the United Nations Conference.
Mr. President, honorable delegates of the United Nations, basking in the hospitality of this city of San Francisco, California, we begin our work. I wish to express my appreciation in the name of the people of my government of Bolivia for the generous welcome which has been accorded to us. Gentlemen, like all the countries of the world, Bolivia is confident in this conference that this conference will initiate an era of peace on the earth. The sentiments of my people are intense because they grow out of a fund of hard historical experiences. This is why the sorrows of this war and the hope of this moment are those of my country, which needs and wants a just peace. Such a peace can be attained if we, who have the mandate of the peoples to defend their dearest aspirations, affirm for the future an era of security, justice, and well-being. Security as a result of collective and immediate action on the part of the states for the elimination of causes of aggression. Right and peace as the necessary means for attaining justice, and the different recourses of international law with equal guarantees for all will give a lofty significance to the ends and objectives which the world proposes to attain. In order that such objectives may be more effective, there is also a need for the classification of an aggressor in the Charter of the World Organization. Thus, all countries would know in advance that they must avoid in their international conduct what they must avoid in their international conduct in order not to incur in collective sanctions. There will, therefore, be no lasting peace if justice in international relations is not established as an essential condition for its maintenance. To attain such peace, ensuring harmony in the common life of states, we are assembled here, honorable delegates, with the certainty that we shall create an international order without precedent in history and capable of eliminating all unjust situations which may be maintained or which it may be attempted to maintain in the new juridical era which is contemplated. Oppression and tyranny are peculiar not only to political power, but also to hunger and want. Well-being is liberation and is justice. The men and the nations who fall into a state of destitution and abandonment constitute fertile soil in which those who periodically seek domination of the world sow their hopes for power. The suffering masses sometimes destroy the foundation of their happiness and in their frenzied desire to find the road of liberation. The excessive difference in remuneration for the same quality and quantity of work is the essence of that inequality which nourishes hatred and which, in giving birth to privileged groups, likewise creates collective tyrannies. The ideal thing is for all men to have equal opportunities for attaining happiness and enjoying the benefits of civilization. The peace for which we long must not have for its purpose the establishment of a social statu quo, because in addition of being anti-human and consequently impossible, such a thing would mean a new form of oppression which would put a fatal end to the principles on which we wish to build peaceful human harmony. It must be a peace dynamic in the desire to find a solution to the social and economical problems of the world. On these fundamental concepts, we base our opinion that raising of the standard of living of the nations, cooperation in the campaign against disease, and assistance in improving food, shelter, and living conditions should no longer, in the modern world, be attitudes emanating from the humanitarian and charitable instinct of the strongest, but rather elementary rights of man and of the need to live in peace. The statute planned at Dumbarton Oaks and proposed for our consideration is a method for organizing the peace. Within its general framework, the obligations established therein are related to the effort made by each of the great nations under whose auspices this conference is being held. Hence, peace and understanding among the great powers form together with the fate of the small ones the working parts of this complex machinery which we are constructing. The sacrifice of the invaded nations, the suffering of those masses harassed by misfortune, and the gigantic effort of the great nations which have unconditionally placed the blood of their sons at the service of humanity, all those things do not fail to be felt by us, even though they are far removed from our land, for we consider that those men and those women are brothers and sisters in grief. For the glorious sacrifices, our eternal gratitude. For those who return victorious, our supreme admiration. This is why the anxieties of the Great Assembly of the United Nations have not been strange to my country, which, through its highest representative body, the Parliament, gave the word of an Indo-American thinker who sketched the general lines of an honest and real law of nations which seek to attain peace on the foundations of justice and law. I cannot fail to quote two fundamental concepts which are now and always be recognized as incontestable truths of universal value. In the community of nations, the possession of power and strength imposes upon the powerful obligations and duties, the neglect of which would bring immediate damage upon the smaller nations and would in the end bring ruin or threat of ruin upon the powerful nations. Any political power that is not used principally, even if though not exclusively, in the service of others, will in the end consume the possessor of such a power. It has fallen upon the representative of a small nation possessing a deep historic tradition to reaffirm the criterion that the greatest power involves always the greatest responsibilities. The exercise of such power constitutes for mankind and for conscientious peoples a series of difficult obligations and duties rather than a privilege. The sacrifices of this war, which is now ending, cannot be fruitless. If in order to prosecute it and lead it to victory, it has been necessary to have the generous contribution of all the free countries, the maintenance of peace requires of the powerful and the weak nations their maximum effort and zeal in order to prevent history from continuing in the path that it has followed so far as a series of lost opportunities. Peace has always been a weak and transitory attempt. It now devolves upon the great powers to attain this purpose in a lasting form. In order not to betray the confidence of the world, it is perhaps desirable to restate an American concept. One cannot be powerful and immune from punishment.
Ladies and gentlemen, I now have the pleasure of recognizing Senor Veloso, the Foreign Minister of Brazil. Senor Veloso.
Here is Senor Veloso, the chairman of the Brazilian delegation, shaking hands with Mr. Stettinius and addressing the delegates at the conference.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I speak in English so that my distinguished American friends here present and the people of the United States may understand me at first hand. In the name of the Brazilian delegation, I wish to say a few words on the death of President Roosevelt. The Brazilian people has lost a devoted friend with the passing away of the greatest champion of freedom, as he was fitly called by Winston Churchill. On the news of that sad event, throughout the vast extent of Brazil, the people, profoundly moved, showed that they well realized the tremendous loss which they, together with the entire world, had suffered. The years of President Roosevelt's life at the White House were years of closest cooperation between Brazil and the United States. Fortunately, we were not deaf to the repeated warnings which, on the eve of war, he gave on the evils which confronted the world. When the hour struck, without counting sacrifices or seeking any reward but the friendship of the American people, Brazil responded to his call for the defense of the Americas and of the civilized world. No one better than President Roosevelt knew the cost to Brazil of the wholehearted contribution to the security of the American continent, the liberation of Europe, and the final victory of democratic ideals. No one more than he who knew Brazil, its people, and its leaders could better value the sincerity and the extent of our share in the war effort. In turn, both on the part of the government and of the people, it became a debt of honor to respond to his idealism, in which we have had always the most absolute faith. On the death of such a great friend, my country feels a certain consolation in the thought that it understood his aims and that it did not spare any effort within the scope of its possibilities to help bring about his high desires. We shall always remember President Roosevelt as the man who, through his generous deeds, so greatly contributed to make the world believe again that goodness and idealism are strong enough to direct the destiny of mankind. We shall always be inspired by the undying memory of his noble heart and his brilliant intelligence. It is still the light of his spirit which inspires us in this assembly. In the work being undertaken, as we follow the arduous path which he was the first to tread, we shall need to raise our thoughts to the heights where his were wont to dwell. He spoke for all of us when he said that in the future juridical world organization, there should be no attempt with the attributions conferred upon the great powers to create a super state possessing its own policing authority. We are seeking, he said, agreements and arrangements through which the nations would maintain, according to their capacities, adequate forces to meet the needs of preventing war and making impossible deliberate preparation for war, and to have such forces available for joint action when necessary. In this lucid conception of a new system of peace and security, distinctions between large and small nations disappear, so that the efforts of all be added together in the aim toward a single objective, even so because nations which are considered small today may be great, rich, and strong tomorrow. It is, therefore, in the equality of political rights, beginning by those of sovereignty, that we must set the foundations of our system, as was recognized by all the speakers in yesterday's session. The Commissaire of Foreign Relations of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the Honorable Mr. Molotov, inquired in his address, however, up to what point would the peace-loving nations be disposed to waive prerogatives and rights in benefit of the efficiency of the future world organization. A nation which has always held in repugnance the resort to force for the solution of disagreements between peoples, and which has always favored moral and juridical solutions, Brazil has never hesitated, when wounded in its sovereignty or in virtue of international obligations, to assume the responsibilities and the burdens of war. While our participation in the struggle of 1914-1918 was a limited one, we threw into the present conflict the resources at our disposal and gave an example of supreme loyalty and confidence when we placed at disposal of our great ally, the United States, air and naval bases from which their forces and ours operated to expel enemy raiders from the South Atlantic and sweep away the submarine menace, ensuring the safety of stream of war material directed toward North Africa and Egypt. There can be no doubt that this represented a considerable advance in the field of military cooperation between nations without detriment to the classical conception of the exercise of sovereignty, since those bases placed at the service of the common cause are and will continue to be Brazilian. The contribution of Brazil to the victory of Allied arms did not stop here, however. Expeditionary forces of the Army and Air Force of Brazil have crossed the Atlantic to fight by the side of our allies on the battlefields and the skies of Italy, where we are still paying at the present time a heavy tribute to the ideals which we defend together. In the event of a new conflict, in face of the progress in modern armament and by force of our geographical situation, we are bound to become at once a battlefront. Exposed in this manner to the aggression of extra-continental powers, we shall constitute the advanced defenses of the continent on the South Atlantic within reach of naval and air operations. The time is past when nations situated at a distance from the initial field of struggle could stay aloof in selfish isolation, safe from destruction, from the crimes and monstrosities of war. No defense is afforded today by natural barriers, by mountains, rivers, or seas. We all know throughout all quarters of the world the risks and dangers of the warlike fury of imperialistic nations. Brazil knows them, America and the world are awake to them. Traditional principles, geographical imperatives, all impel us, Brazilians, therefore, to prevent war and to desire the solid organization of a definitive system of security for the efficiency of which we pledge all our resources in peace and in war without demanding rewards and without measuring sacrifices.
The chairman of the Brazilian delegation, Pedro Velhoso, has just completed his address and is walking off the stage. And here is Mr. Stettinius.
Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to present to you as our closing speaker at this second plenary session the Prime Minister of Canada, Mr. Mackenzie King.
Canadian delegation, a familiar figure to many of the delegates here at the conference, is walking towards the platform now and shaking hands, as each of our speakers has, with Secretary Stettinius, adjusting his glasses. I know he'll reach inevitably for that sheaf of white manuscript sticking from his formal black coat, and bow to Mr. Stettinius. Mackenzie King.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Canadian delegation comes to this conference with one central purpose in view. That purpose is to cooperate as completely as we can with the delegations of other nations in bringing into being as soon as possible a charter of world security. This conference is meeting at a time without parallel in the history of human affairs. The present is one of those moments of transition when an old order is passing away. As representatives of the United Nations, we are all here to help lay the foundations of a new world order. The ends that we seek to serve transcend the limits of race and the bounds of nationality. We would do well to seek to match our deliberations to the rapid movement of events. While the fires of war are still burning fiercely, the opportunity is given to this conference to forge and fashion from those fires an instrument for world security. In the execution of this great task, there should be no avoidable delay. It is ours to give to grief-stricken humanity a hope of which it is in greater need today than it has ever been before. It is ours to help to bring into being a world community in which social security and human welfare will become a part of the inheritance of mankind. The support we owe to the fighting forces of the United Nations must extend beyond the theaters of war. It must look beyond the end of hostilities. We owe it to all who have borne the heat of the strife. We owe it to the memory of those who have given their lives to do all in our power to ensure that their service and their sacrifice shall not have been in vain. In the past, the sacrifices of human life in war have been commemorated in monuments of stone or bronze. The only memorial worthy of the service and sacrifice in this war is one which will help to secure to peoples everywhere the opportunities of a more abundant life. Perhaps this great gathering would permit me, as one who represents a country which has such close ties with the United States, to say how deeply Canada felt and will continue to feel the loss of so close a friend and so good a neighbor as President Roosevelt. To many here who enjoyed his friendship, his death was a deeply moving personal bereavement. To the United States in its national bereavement, I should like again to express our sympathy. But the passing of Franklin Roosevelt was more than a loss to neighboring countries. It is a loss to the whole freedom-loving world. That loss places upon each and every one of us a greater responsibility. If the spirit of Franklin Roosevelt pervades the deliberations of this conference, its success will be assured. The highest tribute which we of the United Nations can pay to his memory by our united efforts is to build a world organization which will express his life's aims and his life's ideals, a system of international cooperation which will banish from the world the threat of war and the fear of war. To those who have come to this continent from other lands, I can express no higher hope for the future of mankind than that out of the instrument we are now fashioning, there may develop relations among all nations, similar to those which for generations have been a common possession of Canada and the United States. May I add a further personal reference? All present will join with Mr. Stettinius in the hope he expressed that before the conference concludes, Mr. Cordell Hull will be sufficiently restored in health to join in our deliberations. Mr. Hull's name will always be associated with the origins of the World Security Organization. His years of devoted service to the cause of world freedom, his great political wisdom, his fortitude at his age in making the arduous journey to Moscow in 1943, and the large share he has had in shaping the proposals we are now considering, have earned for him an enduring place among the founders of the United Nations. The proceedings of this conference have been greatly facilitated by the preparatory work already done at Dumbarton Oaks and at Yalta by the inviting powers. We may all rejoice that the great powers have achieved unified proposals for a World Security Organization. That is a great step forward, a mighty contribution already made towards the establishment and maintenance of world peace. The rapid movement of events on the battlefronts and the heavy demands upon all who are represented here at San Francisco make it most desirable to begin as early as possible the detailed consideration of the proposals before the conference. It is not the intention of the Canadian delegation to put forth in plenary session special amendments to the proposals. Our delegation will express its point of view at an appropriate time and place on specific questions as they arise. Our sole preoccupation in any amendments which we may put forward or support at a later stage will be to help in creating an organization which over the years and decades to come will be strong enough and flexible enough to stand any strains to which it may be subjected. We shall not be guided by considerations of national pride or prestige, and shall not seek to have changes made for reasons such as these. We recognize the principle that power and responsibility must go hand in hand, and that international security depends primarily upon the maintenance of an overwhelming preponderance of power on the side of peace. Power, however, is not exclusively concentrated in the hands of any 4 or 5 states, and the conference should not act on the assumption that it is. Such a position would not only be contrary to the facts as they have been demonstrated in the past 5 years, but it would also be dangerous to the cause of security itself. For it would foster in many smaller countries the development of a new type of isolationism, a feeling that the task of preserving the peace could be left exclusively to great powers. Such a habit of thought would make it difficult for the smaller powers to make their contribution. Experience has shown that the contribution of smaller powers is not a negligible one, either to the preserving of the peace or to its restoration when peace has been disturbed. The people of Canada are firm in their resolve to do whatever lies in their power to ensure that the world will not be engulfed for a third time by a tidal wave of savagery and despotism. That is why our Parliament overwhelmingly endorsed the acceptance of the invitation to Canada to participate in this conference. That is why our Parliament accepted the proposals of the inviting powers as a satisfactory general basis for the discussion of the proposed charter. That is why the delegation from Canada received from Parliament a mandate to use its best endeavors at this conference to further an agreement to establish a World Security Organization. The measure of the unanimity of our country is to be found in its delegation to this conference. The delegates were selected while our Parliament was in session. They were chosen from both houses and from both sides of each house. They represent all important shades of opinion in Canada. In conclusion, may I express my firm conviction that the spirit in which we approach the great task of this conference will determine the measure of its success. It is for each nation to remember that over all nations is humanity. It is for all to remember that justice is the common concern of mankind. The years of war have surely taught the supreme lesson that men and nations should not be made to serve selfish national ends, whether those ends be isolated self-defense or world domination. Nations everywhere must unite to save and to serve humanity.
The address of the Prime Minister of Canada and Chairman of its delegation, Mackenzie King.
Ladies and gentlemen, that brings to a close our second plenary session. I should like to announce that the next plenary session will be held tomorrow morning at 10:30. I shall ask Dr. Sung to preside at that plenary session. The fourth plenary session will be held tomorrow afternoon at 3:30. I shall ask Mr. Molotov to preside at that time. The following fifth plenary session will take place Monday afternoon at 3:30, and at that time I will ask the Right Honorable Anthony Eden to preside over that session. Unless there is further business to come before the meeting, we will stand adjourned until 10:30 tomorrow morning in this same building.
There you have the official close of the second plenary session of the United Nations Conference on International Organization. Temporary President Edward Stettinius, now one of the four permanent presidents of the conference, signaled by his hands, he couldn't find the gavel at that moment, that the meeting had been concluded, and the delegates have now risen after this 2-hour session in the San Francisco Opera House and are slowly walking up the aisles, bathed as they are in a cascade of light from the myriad bulbs of the newsreel and press photographers who have been having a busy afternoon while the speeches have been going on today, getting their fill of pictures of various personalities, the speaker of the moment and others in the delegations. It was interesting to note that putting into action the decision of the steering committee, Presiding Officer Stettinius indicated that the presiding officer of the meetings tomorrow, the two plenary sessions tomorrow, will be Mr. Sung of China and Commissar Molotov of Russia. And at this moment, I noticed as Mr. Stettinius made that indication, which was news to all of us and to Mr. Molotov, Commissar Molotov leaned forward and nodded his agreement from his seat and smiled and talked to his interpreter who was giving him the actual word by word. Just now, Molotov is going up the aisle just about 10-15 feet from us, pursued by a group of photographers who want that one last picture, and there's a phalanx of members of his delegation and assistants beside him to help him make his way. And so we're concluding the second plenary session, notwithstanding the fact that President Stettinius, Presiding Officer Stettinius, has referred to it as a plenary session. The vowel is still open. Plenary session it is in the San Francisco Conference. We heard today, in alphabetical order, addresses to the delegates by the chairman or the leading representative here present of the various delegations. Australia, which brought us an address by Michael Ford. Belgium, in which we heard the address of the chairman of the Belgian delegation, Paul Henry Spaak, the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Bolivia was represented by the ambassador to the United States from Bolivia, Victor Andrade, and Brazil's speaker was the chairman of its delegation, the Minister of State for Foreign Relations, Pedro Velloso. The concluding address was that of W.L. Mackenzie King, Prime Minister of Canada, who is chairman of Canada's delegation. Most of the speeches were relatively formal. The most energetic and vigorous and expository of its nation's stand was that of Michael Ford of Australia, who in fairly detailed blueprint indicated ideas of the Australian delegation for revisions and expansions of the Dumbarton Oak agreements. On the other end of our agenda of this afternoon, Mackenzie King indicated that any detailed changes or ideas from the Canadian delegation would come in later meetings. The business portion of our meeting preceded these addresses by the chairman of the various delegations, indicated a solution of the up to now vexing problem of a presiding officer throughout the period of the conference. The rotating plan of 4 presidents, that is, 4 presidents, one from each of the inviting powers, the chairman of each of the delegations of the United States, Russia, China, and Great Britain, would be designated as presidents, with the power of the other 3 being delegated to Secretary of State Stettinius. Secretary of State Stettinius, on his hand, has put this policy or this solution to the problem into function by designating today the chairman of tomorrow's 2 plenary sessions as the representative of China, Mr. Sung, and the chairman of the Russian delegation, Mr. Molotov. And so this is NBC's booth, rapidly being as deserted as the entire delegation floor is now here in the San Francisco Opera House, the War Memorial Opera House, the scene of the United Nations Conference on International Organization. This is Ben Grauer bidding you good afternoon from San Francisco.